Welcome everyone to Tirtzu Zionist Salon. I'm Doug Altabef, the chairman of the board of Tirtzu, and today I am thrilled to have as our guest a latter-day hero, not only of the Jewish people, but of all people who yearn for peace and harmony in the world. I'm pleased, very pleased, to welcome Jason Greenblatt, who served as President Trump's special representative for international negotiations, and who is one of the three Menschketeers, who, with Jared Kushner and David Friedman, revolutionized the situation not only here in Israel internally, but in the larger Middle East. Jason, welcome, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Jason is also the author of the recently released book, In the Path of Abraham, a riveting account of his challenges, frustrations, exhilarations, and the events that took place under his stewardship, culminating, of course, in the groundbreaking Abraham Accords. It's a book that I read with great relish. I recommend it to every one of you, and it's a book that will inform much of our discussion today. But before we delve into the nitty-gritty of the geopolitical events that you were involved with, Jason, I must tell you that what really moved me, what astounded me, was your personal story. I mean, here you are, you're a real estate lawyer. I mean, I can say that I'm trained as a lawyer. Okay, you're a real estate lawyer. You've worked quite successfully for 20 years for your boss, a man named Donald Trump, who grows to know you very well. And you are an Orthodox Jew living an Orthodox Jewish lifestyle. Suddenly, seemingly unaccountably to many people, Donald Trump finds himself as President of the United States. And for the most intractable, insolvable, persistently frustrating geopolitical issue in the world, he turns not to State Department executives or veterans. He turns not to academic heavyweights or foreign policy gurus. He turns to three guys that he knows very well, that he has worked with very closely, that he trusts. Three guys, yourself, Jared Kushner, David Friedman, all of whom are smart, are shrewd, are trustworthy, and who are Orthodox Jews. And I find in that latter point something very, very poignant, because while no one has ever accused Donald Trump of being a religious man, I think he recognized in the three of you something very important by virtue of the fact that you were religious. And I found myself constantly hearkening back to the Purim story and to the dramatic highlight of the Megillah Esther, where the Haman, having declared disaster for the Jews, Mordecai goes to Queen Esther and famously says, perhaps this was the reason why you were chosen to be the queen. And as I read the book, I kept thinking, there is something here of hashgacha pratit. There's something here of divine providence in the choice of you, in the choice of Jared, in the choice of David Friedman. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure. Sorry. Look, it's a great analysis. I would say there's no doubt in my mind that Hashem's hand was in all of this. And Jared was a great team leader, good friend. David is a good friend. But the three of us were also surrounded by a great team: Vice President Pence, Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Avi Berkowitz, so many others. I'm probably forgetting a bunch of names. And I think that the lineup that we had under President Trump's leadership, plus the lineup that we had in the Middle East, Bibi Netanyahu, and the Arab leaders who signed the Abraham Accords, those who worked with those leaders who signed the Abraham Accords, and even those countries who didn't, I'd like to call them, didn't yet sign the Abraham Accords, but didn't stand in the way of the Abraham Accords, and in fact really tacitly supported the Abraham Accords. That whole thing, I think, was hashgacha pratis, and I don't take that for granted.
Right. Well, you know, as they say, it takes a village or it takes a region, but and your modesty is very self-effacing, but there had to be a tip of the spear, and the three of you really were the tip of the spear. So now you've been appointed. It's day one, and you walk into the office, so to speak. One of the things you wrote very affectingly about, and I thought it was one of the best summaries I've read, about the conventional wisdom that attaches to the the Palestinian-Israeli situation, the Arab-Israeli situation, dealing with Iran. And I counted three, and it may have been more, but I lost count, three references to the adage universally attributed to Einstein as to the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that sort of summarized or encapsulated what it sounded like you perceived the status quo to be day one on the job for you. Why don't you give us a little bit of a flavor of what you walked into?
Sure, and I think to do that, I want to touch on the word expert, which I think you used in your introductory remarks. You know, you mentioned the State Department, and I don't want to denigrate the State Department and the National Security Council. They were my arms and legs. I couldn't have done my job without them. But they and conventional thinkers, whether it's the media, think tankers, many of them were stuck in the past. Many of the diplomats were stuck in the past. So my view, and this may be controversial to some, is that there are no experts on how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are experts who know the history of the conflict. There are experts who understand both sides' stories depending on where they sit. They sympathize with one side or the other. But nobody is an expert on how to resolve it, because in the end, you have an opinion. I have an opinion, David, Jared, everybody has an opinion. So we may understand the file, the experts may understand the file, but nobody can claim that they have the key to unlock this. And probably the most important part of this is what resulted the Abraham Accords, right? You had John Kerry, who was a Secretary of State, who was schooled in all the traditional talking points, and not too far before President Trump took office, was crystal clear that his view was there is no way, no matter what everybody says, that the Arabs will ever make peace with Israel until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved. Now, that might have been true 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, perhaps even 10 years ago. But that wasn't true under our watch. We saw green shoots throughout the time that I was at the White House. It started slow. The initial diplomatic meetings with all the leaders went through the typical talking points, all sorts of Palestinian flavor demands that, in our view, were unrealistic, unfair, unachievable. But over time, once they put their talking cards down and started to talk what I like to say is tachlis, for those of your listeners who don't know what tachlis is, it's a Yiddish word that I guess best translates into getting down to business. Right. I explained the word tachlis to the region. The region understood it. The region is tachlis oriented, maybe a little bit less forward than Israelis, excuse me, but they understand the word tachlis. And our point was, look, we have a lot of things to do in the United States government, in the White House. We're either going to try to work on this and work through this, and if we succeed, fantastic. And, you know, please help us along the way. But if you're unwilling to help us and unwilling to engage, no problem. We'll work on some other things.
Okay, so you talked about we're trying to succeed with something. And you made the point several times in the book about the reigning obsession with process over results, and that you guys were about results and trying to succeed. So my question for you is, as you get ready to start your tenure, do you have a mandate to create a plan? In other words, go out there and figure out what the plan should be? Or do you have a mandate to go out and, as you talked about, do a listening tour, see what the where the fault lines are. Where are the opportunities? Are we missing something? Are we behind the times, so to speak? You alluded to maybe 30, 40, 20 years ago it was different, but did we need to catch up with a reigning reality? Were you starting with the idea that there would be some kind of a plan, or were you starting with the idea that you needed to really get the lay of the land?
Well, we had several mandates. The first mandate was improving the U.S.-Israel relationship, which President Trump felt had suffered under the prior administration. The second mandate was seeing what we can do to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if it was resolvable. And the third one was looking under the rocks to see if there was any truth to there being a possibility of resolving some of the Israeli-Arab conflict. But number two, of course, was one of the most important things. And the mandate was figure it out. But as a lawyer, of course, you can't figure anything out unless you study it. So most of 2017 was studying the conflict, hearing from everybody, understanding what was done in the past, why people felt the way they felt, not just in Israel, not just among the Palestinians, throughout the Arab countries, Europe, the United Nations, and of course the US government. And we started to develop what I would call a term sheet listing sort of the key issues, what the proposed solutions had been in the past, why those solutions might not have worked depending on which side or the other you were listening to. And that eventually did morph into what ended up being a 60-something page plan with a very, very large economic plan that Jared Kushner spearheaded for the Palestinians. So the short answer to your question is, it wasn't a mandate to listen, but there's no way to get to the mandate of seeing if you could figure it out without listening. And that took many, many, many months in 2017.
In the course of your listening tour, were there particular things you were hearing, and either from the Israelis, the Palestinians, or Arab rulers, that really surprised you, that, or conversely said, wow, here is an opening we did not fully appreciate before?
It was a mixture. Certainly among ordinary Palestinians, what surprised me, meaning not leadership, but what surprised me was they were thirsting for better lives. Yes, they want their own state. Yes, they want, let's call it, some portion of Jerusalem. Yes, they want a whole bunch of things, including contiguous land is one of their important claims, their important desires, perhaps I should say. But among the leadership, they were very quick to stick to their normal talking points. They really didn't give us any room in terms of trying to figure out whether there was any flexibility. Their view was very much, here's what we want, but we'll talk about it and we can resolve it. No level of detail. And over time, it became clear that they weren't ready to show their cards at all. I think their general view was that they had given enough in the past, although if you ask them to point out what they had given, there's really no substance to that claim. Among the Israelis, there's no doubt that security was at the very top of the list, and understandably so. Israel is a country that's been attacked relentlessly since its formation, even before its formation. And we took that to heart very strongly. Hopefully we did a very good job with that in the plan. Bibi Netanyahu was quite the opposite of President Abbas and the others. He had very clear desires, expectations, ways to resolve the conflict, but he was willing to entertain anything. If he didn't like the idea, he was clear in his arguments, he was effective in his arguments as to why it couldn't work or wouldn't work or shouldn't work. But he was also extremely willing to be creative and listen and engage.
You had a reception in Arab countries that was probably very different from the reception that President Obama got and Secretary Kerry got. Tell us a little bit about that and what was driving that difference in reception.
Sure. Well, the reception of President Trump, the Trump administration, was excitement from the Arab countries. They felt that President Obama had abandoned the region with the Iran deal. They were nervous with the Iran deal in place, and they saw in President Trump somebody who understood the danger of the region, the danger of the Iran deal, the desire to stabilize, but also not to dictate. So it was a very, very excited, warm welcome. And then the reception of me, and I guess Jared as well, because we spent a great deal of time in the region as observant Jews, was quite the opposite than the reception we got from the media. The media, when we were all first appointed, including David, was very quick to say, you know, what do these three observant Jews know anything about the Arab countries? How are they ever going to make peace? And on the contrary, I would say the fact that we were observant resonated with the Arab countries. They understood it. They're religious people themselves. Some are observant, some are not observant, but they were extremely respectful of me being an observant Jew. And by the way, so were the Palestinians. The Palestinians always made sure to have kosher food there. Whenever I met with them, they were warm. They made no issue of religion, no matter what the media tried to spin in terms of our religious observance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fascinating observation, and I've noticed that many times, that people of faith of different religions often find that they have more in common on a certain level than they do with their own co-religionists who are not that interested in the religion. But were you getting any hints right away that, you know, we're thinking differently about Israel? You talked about Iran and Obama. Many people think that President Obama inadvertently is one of the fathers of the Abraham Accords by virtue of the fact that he scared the Sunni countries so badly that they did a weighing analysis. Okay, here's Iran, here's Israel. Israel doesn't look so bad. Were you picking up on that fairly quickly?
Yeah, so look, the Abraham Accords has many parents, many grandparents. In fact, there were Israeli diplomats going to the region way before we came on the stage. I would count President Obama as being a reluctant, unknowing father of the Abraham Accords, because there's no doubt that by signing the Iran deal and by having the attitude that he had toward the Arab countries and even to Israel, he laid the chess pieces down in a way that allowed us to follow that path. And indeed, the Arab leadership started after the first several diplomatic meetings where, you know, I'm exaggerating, but we would hear, Israel, Israel. Shortly after that, you know, the word Israel was stated. I remember when President Trump made his first trip to his first overseas trip, which happened to be to the region. Saudi Arabia was the first stop, followed by Israel, then the Vatican. But in Saudi Arabia, he made a landmark speech in front of many, I can't even remember, 50-something Muslim and Arab countries. I remember seeing the draft of the speech, seeing Israel mentioned several times in the draft, and thinking, that's remarkable. He's going to talk about Israel the way he talks about it here in America, in front of all these countries in Saudi Arabia. That's fantastic. He's not going to shy away from it. And there was no blowback whatsoever. It became a natural conversation with Arab leadership throughout the region, because they understand deep down that Israel has a place in the region, Israel is needed in the region, and some were willing to resolve that conflict already, those who signed the Abraham Accords, and others it's going to take more time.
Right. So that's an interesting observation about the speech. It's a little bit of a chicken or the egg question. Was he willing to talk that way because he had intimations that it would be received okay, or was it received okay because he was willing to talk that way, take a leadership stance, say this is the way things are, and by the way, the Arab countries were you know, basically receptive to hearing that?
Well, it's definitely the latter, but also I would say President Trump was not a diplomat. He was a businessman. He wasn't a politician, right? He wasn't there to win votes. He wasn't there to, you know, placate the group, you know, the visitors, the attendees of the speech. He was there to talk business, and he wasn't afraid of speaking the truth. None of us, not David, not Jared, not myself, nor others, Nikki Haley at the UN, Mike Pompeo in the State Department, none of us were afraid to speak the truth. Sometimes the truth is hard, and you should say it politely, respectfully, diplomatically, but you shouldn't dance around the issue. And President Trump, as most people probably have gathered by now, is not one to dance around the issue. He says what he means. I'd much rather have a politician who I know what's in his head and in his heart coming out of his mouth than a politician who says things that you kind of scratch your head and say, well, what's he really thinking? So ultimately, by being so direct and by speaking about Israel and by speaking about the region and his support for the safety and security of the region and folding Israel into the region, I think he began to pave the path toward people looking at things in a new way.
Certainly, President Trump did things that were here in Israel, greeted with enormous enthusiasm, whether it was recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, closing the consulate and folding it into the embassy, recognizing sovereignty on Israel's sovereignty on the Golan Heights, and in the latter days, Mike Pompeo's statement that settlements are not per se illegal. These were all enormous achievements for us and greatly, greatly appreciated. As background for what would evolve into the plan, and you talked about how the term deal of the century was sort of foisted on you by the media. It was not a term that the administration coined. But the plan, the vision plan for progress and prosperity, was really a business investment plan, an economic investment plan. And was there, you talked about in the book that there were really two parallel paths. There was the Israeli-Palestinian path, and then there was the Arab path, the Arab state path. Was it intended that there would be linkage between those as you developed those plans?
Yeah, initially they should have been linked. Ultimately, at least from my perspective, and of course if Bibi Netanyahu felt differently, he could have rejected it, but it made no sense to me, and I'm sure it made no sense to David or Jared, that Israel would try to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and not at the same time resolve the Israeli-Arab conflict, at least with those countries that you could resolve it. Nobody's resolving that with Syria right now, or some of the other countries, likely including Lebanon and some others. So our goal was to try to resolve as many of them as we could at the same time. I mean, after all, why should Israel make all these incredibly tough compromises that it would have to make to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then find out the next morning that there was still an Israeli-Arab conflict with countries they should have relationships with. But as time went on, it became clear that the Palestinians were out. They weren't the first administration they walked away from. Right. They walked away when President Trump recognized Jerusalem. We did think that they would come back. We thought it could take anywhere from 6 months to perhaps 18 months. In the end, they didn't come back at all. And we just kept our heads down. So after President Trump recognized Jerusalem, and I started to get in messages, I don't want to say that they were really messages from President Abbas, because I have no idea. There were people, Palestinians and others, who came to my office in the White House who said that, you know, they were there on behalf of so-and-so and so-and-so, and I always assumed that they were more likely there on their own accord, not President Abbas's accord. I don't want to say that he was reaching out. That would be unfair. But their view was, you know, give the Palestinians something. President Trump promised to recognize Jerusalem. He could undo that. Or he did that, don't move the embassy. Or tell the Palestinians that even though he recognized Jerusalem, the Palestinians will have East Jerusalem as the capital. You know, every which way trying to give the Palestinians something in order for them to come back to the table. And my view was, if they want to come back to the table, they should come back to the table because they have a future. They could have a future if they took this process seriously. Right. But we're not in the business of paying people just to come to the table and then nothing happens. What's the point of the payment?
How resonant was a $50 billion investment program with the Palestinians?
Unfortunately, not resonant. And I'll take you back a little bit before that $50 billion program that Jared had created. One of my deepest frustrations, because you mentioned frustrations at the beginning of the talk, is that the Palestinian leadership has zero interest in improving Palestinian lives and the Palestinian economy. I tried time and again throughout 2017 to help with their economy in many different ways. My view was, and I shared this with President Abbas and the late Saab Erekat and others, look, we don't know if we can resolve this conflict, but at the same time that we're trying to resolve the conflict, we want to help your economy. If we resolve the conflict and we help your economy, then the day after will be great because you're going to be way ahead of the game. And if we don't resolve the conflict but we help your economy, your people are better off. So what's the problem? Their view is this is a political issue. Don't confuse us with the economy. Partly there is truth to the claim that by helping the economy, the Palestinians become, more affluent and less interested in their political cause, and that's been something that's been going on for a very long time. That was incredibly, incredibly frustrating. Nevertheless, since we were putting out a peace plan, Jared believed, as did I and others, that there was no point in creating something and then finding out that there's no way to actually succeed at it. We spent a great deal of time with teams across the U.S. government and even some outsiders who weighed in, putting together this amazing $50 billion package. And what happened? We hosted a conference in Bahrain. The King of Bahrain, this is before the Abraham Accords, was very gracious, allowed us to host a conference. And not only did the Palestinian leadership not attend, they boycotted it, they tried to get others to boycott it, and some Palestinians who showed up, but when they went back to their homes in the Palestinian territories were actually arrested.
Right. Amazing. There was quite a bit of uncertainty, some controversy about whether Israel could or would declare sovereignty over some parts of Area C or the Jordan Valley, and it seems like that uncertainty actually provided a great opportunity and really did result in the linkage of a Palestinian track and the Arab track. And what I'm referring to is the outreach by the foreign minister of the UAE saying, hey, if you would delay a sovereignty declaration, maybe we can come to the table with a normalization idea. Is that a fair statement? Is that a fair way of looking at it?
It is. It's one of the pieces of the puzzle, perhaps the last piece of the puzzle that sort of clicked into place. There was a trading card there. It wasn't intended to be a trading card.
Right.
I support Israel's annexation. Annexation is actually the incorrect term. I support Israel's application of Israeli law or extension of sovereignty over those areas of the plan that were supposed to end up as part of Israel. Of course, David Friedman, I'm sure Jared did as well. There's no doubt in my mind that Bibi Netanyahu did as well. I think it was a significant condition for him to do that as well. And that's why the plan was released with that. But it turns out that's what was seized upon as a trading card later in order to move the Abraham Accords forward.
Right. That trading card, as you say, was that at their initiative, the UAE's initiative, or was it pointed out to them by members of your team that this could possibly be employed as a way of getting what you want, and there'd be an exciting quid pro quo for that?
So by that time, I wasn't in the administration anymore, so I don't know. I know what I know from the people that were involved. There's a little bit of discussion over how that actually went down. I don't know the accurate answer, but by all accounts, it seems that the UAE was the one who reached out and decided that that would be a useful trading card, but I don't know the complete story of it.
Mm-hmm. The UAE seems to have a very broad perspective on this whole situation, really quite remarkable. There was an article in the paper the other day about the 2-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords by a UAE political analyst, and he made the point that it's been a remarkable success. It's been a success not only because it has normalized situation with Israel, but it has helped the UAE normalize its posture vis-a-vis Iran, which I was very surprised to read, that they feel that somehow this kind of development has really fostered the cause of moderation, of possible agreement, and they see it as something that should hopefully continue and expand. Does that surprise you to hear the idea that it's maybe also helping them vis-a-vis the Iranians?
I think it doesn't surprise me at all. I think what people have to understand, whether it's about the UAE or Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others, is that they're in as much danger from Iran as Israel is in danger. Their job, their leader's job in those other countries, is to protect their citizens, to protect the country, to protect the assets, the same way it's the job of the Prime Minister of Israel to do that. So the Band-Aid was ripped off. Everybody now understands that peace can be achieved between Israel and its Arab neighbors. There really was almost no blowback whatsoever. Yes, you had Palestinians who said some very nasty things about the UAE and Bahrain. I'm not sure what they said about Morocco, but things like the late Saeb Erekat, who said something about the UAE stabbing the Palestinians in the back with an Arab dagger. That's not an exact quote, but that was more or less the message. But other than those nasty statements, eventually people calm down and realize this is reality. Now, the UAE and all the countries in the region have to figure out how do they deal in this new world with Iran. Is the Biden administration going to sign a deal with Iran? What does that deal look like? Is it indeed weaker and shorter? Is it dangerous? By all accounts, it seems the answer is yes. Last week, people thought the deal may be imminent. This week, people think it's not imminent at all. So I think we have to give them, the UAE and others, the space that they need to normalize or not, have a relationship with, with Iran or not, exchange ambassadors with Iran or not, the same way we respect Israel's right to defend itself and make its own sovereign decisions to protect itself and to move its country forward. We have to give the Arab countries that same latitude. I don't think if Iran and the UAE were to normalize in some sense that that's an anti-Israel move. You have to think about it as a pro-UAE move, or to use the other countries, a pro-Qatar move or a pro-Saudi move. They're not looking to harm Israel by doing that. They're looking to do what they need to do the same way Israel needs to do what it needs to do.
Right. Apropos of that, you made a great point in the book, which I had not appreciated, when you talked about the demographic challenge that faces many of these Arab countries with under 25 population of, enormous percentages, and that one opportunity that comes of the Abraham Accord is job creation, trade furtherance, that will help them domestically deal with what could be a tinderbox if otherwise ignored.
Right. So that's part of the new Middle East that some people haven't caught up to understand yet, which is, it's oil, right? They're trying to move away from oil. But it's also a recognition that times have changed and they have to train their young people. There are so many of them, and this is a young population that's been exposed to the world in ways that their prior generations have not been. Many of them have been educated overseas, even if they haven't. With social media and all sorts of other opportunities, they understand the world. So they are looking, each of these countries has their own plan, but they're looking to bring their youth forward in a way that's extremely positive. I'm very bullish on the region, and I think that it's a very positive thing for Israel and for the region, and frankly for America.
If you were to handicap it, Jason, who would you say could be on deck for joining the Abraham Accords?
Well, it's a question I get a lot. I don't like to answer by naming a name, but I would say this. Rather than focus on who's next to sign, or many times I would say 80% of the time I get a question of when is Saudi going to sign, I think we have to recognize the positive things, the momentum that has happened since the Abraham Accord. So as an example, if you take Saudi Arabia opened up air routes for Israel for flights when the Abraham Accords were signed, so that flights could go from Israel to Bahrain and Israel to the UAE. Only, I don't know, maybe 7, 8, 9 weeks ago, now they opened up all the skies for all flights, which would, of course, would include Israel. That's a huge decision by Saudi Arabia. I think we should applaud Saudi Arabia. There are other things that they've been doing as well. And rather than sort of pressure Saudi Arabia or ask, when are you going to sign, when are you going to sign, let's recognize that Saudi Arabia is going through tremendous transformation, while a relationship with Israel is on that list somewhere. It's not the highest part of the list. It certainly shouldn't be the highest part of the list, given what they're trying to transform. And let's take things step by step, and hopefully Israel will continue to be in the mix in a positive way. And I think that's true of Qatar as well. I think that hopefully it's true of Oman. I don't know. It's a fairly new leadership there. The Sultan, who we dealt with, a remarkable individual, is no longer there, so I don't know their current thinking. Unfortunately, it is not true of Kuwait, as far as I can tell. It's certainly not true of Lebanon. I think I've heard that those two countries are competing for who will sign the accords last.
Right. Speaking of transformations, there is a new sheriff in town in Washington. And the Biden administration seems to be much more of a throwback to the Obama administration than it does to seem to be a continuation of the Trump administration vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the Middle East. How does that impact, in your view, both Israel and the future of the Abraham Accords?
Well, it's a mixed result, right? On Saudi Arabia, which is a very important issue, President Biden was extraordinarily disrespectful to the country, to the Crown Prince. On the recent trip that he had about 2 months ago, 8 weeks ago, I don't remember, I think he began to turn a page in that book. I think he needs many more pages and chapters to turn. And if he doesn't, then the Abraham Accords is not going to be on anybody's list. And that's true especially when it comes to the Iran deal. As long as the Iran deal looks like it may be signed in the form that people are worried about, and just about everybody in that region is worried about it, that's also going to hinder progress on the Abraham Accords unless something dramatic changes. As it relates to Israel, I think his trip was mixed. I think Joe Biden is somebody who I do think supports Israel, but I do think they're a throwback to some of the Obama policies. When you see things like Joe Biden, President Biden visiting the East Jerusalem Hospital Network without an Israeli presence, that's a very negative sign. That shows that he disrespects American law about Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. I don't think he would visit any capital in the world and tell the leader or the leadership, you stay back, you're not coming with me while I take this visit. Because between the lines, what's he really saying? Because this area isn't yours, or may not be yours, or you shouldn't be yours. So that's a very negative thing. I think they continue to placate the Palestinians. They continue to get funding. They've refunded UNRWA, the so-called refugee agency, which is a corrupt organization that leaves no future for the Palestinians who live there or who are registered there, most of whom are not technically refugees, even though under the law, under that agency's rules, they are refugees. But that's the same as saying I'm a Hungarian refugee because my parents fled Hungary during and after the Holocaust, which I'm not a Hungarian refugee. So there are many ways he's going backwards. Where I will give him credit is, number one, he's not pushing for an Israeli-Palestinian peace effort at the moment. I think he's smart enough to recognize now is not the time to do it. So in that sense, he's not a throwback to the Obama administration. And by the press accounts, and I hope this is true, he is sending a clear message to the Palestinians not to pursue statehood at the United Nations, at the upcoming United Nations General Assembly. That's also a positive sign. And I'll just end the question with one more point, because I think it's important. Barbara Leaf from the State Department visited Israel, and the press reports are saying that she's pressing Israel, the U.S. government is pressing Israel to help the Palestinians because, they're at a low point and things are very bad there and the security is very bad there. That's a movie we see over and over and over and over again. The answer should be the Palestinians should get their own act together. Yes, there are things Israel might be able to do to help them along. But putting the burden, the onus, the responsibility on Israel instead of the Palestinians is among the ways we got into this mess in the first place.
We call that here the soft racism of low expectations, that it denies moral agency to the Palestinians, that somehow they are incapable of taking care of business in a profound self-help way, and that they have to be bailed out at every turn. And as you say, it just doesn't resonate anymore. It's just something that we've seen the movie and we don't want to watch the sequel to it. So as we end, I want to just ask you go back to your personal story. You have any plans to return to diplomacy, or you're very happy to be back in the private sector?
Well, now I sort of get the best of both worlds. I get to live with my wife and kids again and be a father, be a husband. But I also very much am in the space. A lot of what I do is connecting Israeli and American companies with countries and companies in the Arab world. So I get to be a fake diplomat, if you will, for the moment. But one of the ways that you make peace is by building bridges. So I spend a lot of time continuing to build bridges, economic bridges, friendships. And I think that's important. I think what everybody should realize is that our team is no longer there, but that doesn't mean that they, you know, Israelis, those who want to understand the Arab countries, whether it's Jews in America, Jews elsewhere, non-Jews, Christians, everybody, go be informal ambassadors yourselves, understand the region, today's region, understand the country, build the friendships, because the more people build those friendships and bridges, the more likely down the road over time, more peace bridges can be built.
You built a George Washington Golden Gate Bridge in your efforts from 2017 to 19, and hopefully that bridge is durable and lasting and has the effect of creating other bridges in turn. You did a great service to us here in Israel, Jason. You've done a great service to the people of the Middle East. We're profoundly grateful. And all we can say is thank you. I want to remind our readers, the book is In the Path of Abraham. It's a must-read. Everyone should pick it up. And thank you again for your time today, and Chatzlacha.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.